picking up a candle. He was horrified to see her bed sheets soaking wet.
Alright, welcome to episode 6, Wet the Sheets. That refers to sheet wetting. This is going to be about my assessment of an enhanced water control for a grinder called sheet wetting. But I want to kind of set it up and give some background here because the purpose of my assessment is to make changes in the workplace to convince the stakeholders, the people that need to be convinced, to put in resources and time and work and effort and to change the way they do things, which, as you know, is not easy in an organization. It's not easy to convince somebody, especially if you're not their supervisor, you're not in their chain of command, to change the way they do something. And I think sensor data can really help with that, can put it over the top or be much more convincing. So I want to show you that part of it as well as just the interesting facets. I'm going to try to stay on track. There's so much to talk about, and there's so many complex things that I could go off on a tangent to discuss that are fascinating, but I'll try to stay on track as best I can. But there are a few things I want to stress here. So I already mentioned this in the intro. We need water and we need air. And air meaning that we need to move the dust and the water clouds out of the work area as soon as possible, out of the building preferably, but at least away from where the people are. And then once you get to that point, you're still fighting with the action level. You know, if you want to keep the majority of daily exposures down below the action level, you've got to attack these areas that can put you above it, and one of those is tools. That's what I'm going to stress today, is about certain tools. A lot of this stuff is intuitive, but it's still, you still have to put the work in to convince people. And you don't want to make assumptions. It may seem intuitive, it might have worked somewhere else, but you don't want to assume that it's going to work in your place. You want to put your best foot forward and do the research and try to demonstrate that it is actually going to work. So I want to quick talk about grinding and blade work. I just want to quick show you. So these, I had 5 sensors. I was actually doing my first side-by-side sampling with compliance sampling. So I put 3 sensors together and 2 sensors together. Then I did do personal samples, 2 personal samples in this particular area here. And here this is just showing you the 3 sensors and the side-by-side lab sample. These are the other 2 here. You can see this PPI, and these are the inlets for that. But the first point I want to make is, and I'm going to kind of show you over and over again, that throughout the day, the highest dust creating activities, which is intuitive, is grinding and blade cutting. And this is just a quick example here. So we've got the Busey sensor here, the Joe sensor here. He's grinding, and we see this, it's climbing up because of the dust made by the grinding. Over here he's using a soft pad, and we can kind of insinuate that that soft pad isn't creating as much dust because Joe isn't going up as much, and we also don't know how much of the grinding is over here affecting this, or for that matter, how much a soft pad is, but we have fans here on the wall, so we can pretty much expect maybe a little bit of meeting in the middle, but you'll see it again and again that grinding and blade cutting is something you want to concentrate on. So this is tools. If I want to bring my levels down on a day-to-day basis below the action level, I want to cut down on the dust that grinding and blade work makes. So now, even though this is a good peak here, this is minor for this day of sampling, but it is a peak. And so you'll usually find when there's a peak, now this peak here is much larger. Sinkholes seem to be very difficult. This isn't something I've studied in detail, but you know, the grinder is making a lot of dust, and then when you're trying to put water on now a vertical surface and the edge, and I think it's hard to keep that surface wet, and so you'll see I think a lot of dust, especially when they're doing a sinkhole. So that's what this represents. There's some compressed air too, that might have factored in. All right, now what the first point I want to make too is, so we see here, this is the end of the day, and you see this is a matter, this is, unless this isn't the end of the day. This is at 8:56. So I think that's just that, this peak here in a different form. But I want to show you here, maybe this is the time. I don't think so, but we'll see. All right, so the fans are off. So this is very significant. So now we failed on our ventilation, right? So this is the point I want to make here, because the sensors are not, admittedly, in one of the limitations is they don't directly read the personal samples, right? They're an area sample. But it's important to understand that in a granite shop, so complex, so multivariable, and one of the variables is what other people are doing in your area. So the dust sensors can help with that as far as keeping track of where the dust is going. Yeah, so that peak over there was a magnification of that grinding. But here's where the majority of the exposure happened at the end of the day here. And so this is from 1:12 to really, to here, so we'll say 1:54, 2 o'clock. So in the matter of an hour. And what was going on during that time? Well, only one of the persons was really creating dust, and that's the point I'm going to make here. But we have the blade come out. And so my contention is that the dust from this person, basically the personal samples came out almost identical and much higher than we'd want, let's say. And that was strictly due, this person's sample was identical to him, and both of their samples that day were really driven by this 1 hour time period. Remember, the fans are off and you're using a blade. That's not a good combination. And so I communicated, this is one of the ways I was getting them to keep the fans on, is I showed this example of, with the fans off, you had two people with the same exposure. That we'll call it bad. Got a bad result. And if that particular person had been moved away, or the fans had been on, if they had been out of the kind of sphere of influence of this dust, we would have only had one sample bad in that case. So that's kind of the point I wanted to make here, is one thing that we can do with the sensors, while they're not being worn, they don't really tell us the personal exposure. The fact is that people can be affected by other work. And so we need to keep track of that, account for that, and prevent that from happening. Because this one of these people that was over didn't really, it had nothing to do with what they did. So this is again another visual, how I see it. Now all the sensors are here and here. Okay, where these are the 3 and the 2, but you get the idea here. And this is really revealed when we look at their personal samples. So here we have the fans off, bad deal. I think that if we would have had the fans on, it would have drawn most of the dust out and he would have had a different story. Okay, so now you're saying we're 7 minutes in and we haven't even talked about sheet wetting. I just want to emphasize this point, and I'm just going to talk in passing again. This is a very interesting finding here. So now I have the sensors in a box, and I don't really need to illustrate that. What you need to see here is on different days they were basically, he was doing the same thing. He was cutting on a slab, and you see here in the same location with a blade, and we actually get different results. So when they're kind of both in the same location, and I think generally everything's the same, the fans are on, there's a door open, we get a much lesser peak here than we get with this day, which is something to note. But we also will see here that this peak on a different sensor shows up when it doesn't show up on this particular day. So when they get to do this cut towards the wall with the fans this way, we see here on this day, this sensor that's right here, that's right over here, bumped up the Busey sensor on this particular day. And on this particular day, there was no Busey bump, which is fascinating and something. And this, I bring this up just to first highlight that, again, there's just so much variability with this. So, and then also on this particular day, okay, the grinding created the most dust at the sensor that most picked it up, the Hunter sensor. But on the other day, the blade created the highest peak and the most dust, while the grinding was less. So that, again, this is the variability. This is really different kind of factors here. And I'm also going to quick point out, because I'm going to mention this when I do the sheet wetting testing, is there is a spot when they go along this here, when they're right by the fans. I have numerous examples of where the sensors kind of don't do anything, right? They bottom out because now most of the dust is going away from the sensors and away from the person out the fan. Now I add a third day here, this day here, and you see there's still blade work on relatively the same orientation and slab. So now we have these dotted lines, and we see here we have a different level. Now it's kind of in the middle for that other location, but we see the Busey bump again. So just like this one had the Busey bump, this one has a Busey bump, and it has some more, well, probably about the same Busey action. So, but here again, we see really 3 different peaks at the same location, 3 different days, although they're essentially using the blade the same way. So I wanted to make that point. And if that's not enough, here I want to show you one more example here. So this is 1 hour averages. This is our nice dashboard with the 5 sensors. In this case, they're in a box, but we see here that exposure for that day, that time weighted average is going to be driven by what was going on at this time and this time with these peaks. And this is a zoom in on the 1 o'clock peak and what was going on there, and basically blade work and grinding in a sinkhole. So over here is the grinding of the sinkhole, very near the Busey sensor, and over here was the blade work that brought us this. So just another example of why you would want to tackle grinding and blade work. I also want to show you now something else. So here we have a grinder. I'm going to zoom in here. So now he's taking it on the top here. Now there's air blows out of the grinder. This is a pneumatic grinder, and there's an exhaust that is on this side, I believe, and blows out. And I wanted to show you, this is, I don't know if this is from the grinding, but you see here how you can see the water and dust in the sunlight. I call it, it's like a flamethrower. So you can see the water that's getting thrown off this grinder in that direction. I mention this because I don't know if it's the case in this particular, what was going on here. It might just be water getting thrown all around, and we can only see it when the light is right. But you're going to see a directional attitude from when I use the grinder in the sheet wetting test. So I wanted just to point that out and just show you this is a really neat visual here on that. So now we get to the good stuff. So as part of my argument or setting the stage here for what I'm about to show you, this is part of my convincing to the stakeholders. And as you know, I call RASCAL the remote assessment of silica controls to alert and learn. So we're assessing a control in this case, and we're learning. And that's going to help us set an alarm, and that's going to help us reduce exposures. So The first thing I did, I came across this doing some research. So I came across this study here where they introduce sheet wetting, and they say the sheet wetting performs well. So they were assessing the two different kinds of water. So either having a spray kind of outside the grinding disc and then the center feed. This is what we usually have. So they were assessing the center feeds, comparing them to each other, but then they also tried the sheet wetting, and there's different ways of doing sheet wetting. In this case, they had a hose. And so the results they got, I want to concentrate on the sheet wetting. Now, one of the issues is they did the sampling different, and so they can't directly compare the results. So site visit 1, this is when they assessed the water spray compared to the center feed. And what they did is they had a high volume pump, and they only ran it during grinding. So this 19 minutes, this 17 minutes of time, this was only during grinding. So they were turning it on and off because the grinding there was not 18 minutes straight of grinding. But then they got their stats. They got the residual dust and the time weighted average residual silica. And so they were able to compare the two. On the second and third site visits, they did the sheet wetting, but they let the sample run. So they didn't turn it off when they stopped grinding. So here we had 95 minutes, here we had 167 minutes, 132 minutes. This is both downtime or whatever else they were doing and the sheet wetting. So you can't compare these two, but this is the results that they got. And so what they do is they bring in another study and they compare that to it. So I wanted to show that here. So they had a study, another NIOSH study, where the normal one water control grinding, they got a full shift time weighted average of 120 RCS. Okay, and what they got here was 33. So they compare those two and they say, the sheet wetting will work. Now that's kind of convincing. This is kind of intuitive. You're adding more water to the situation, and they talk about that in the paper. You would think it would do a better job trapping the dust. But and this is kind of why I went through and I showed you the variations of day to day. This, 2016, I think this is 2021. This is entirely, who knows what was going on between the two and what the differences were. So it's kind of tenuous to compare that. And I hope what I showed you before kind of brings that point home. I did find it interesting that, so they did area samples on the first day, and I don't know, it's not clear what was going on in the area, but they had fairly high area samples. You see here, I think it averaged out to 50, I think is what the average was for the area samples, which to me is kind of high. Like I said, I don't know if it was right up in there with them. I was thinking more of an area sample as kind of a background, or where there's not anything else going on, and then they were maybe going to subtract that from the results, but they don't subtract anything from those results. So I think this is just more of in the process area. So this is to be expected, but this may also, again, if it's not by the active production area, then I think they got bad ventilation. So that's my point with that, is you really, while it's promising the results, you really can't compare the two. And I kind of belabor here, I do this write up, that, because you have time not grinding, what I did is I said, well, we can predict what it was with the sheet wetting, what it was actually during the grinding. We make an assumption about what percentage of time was their grinding, and then what the level when there was no grinding was. And you can kind of make estimates here. So in this case here, if you had 40 minutes of grinding, which is 25% of the time, you come up with 77 micrograms per meter cube of exposure during the grinding, but then it could go as high as 156 if you change it to 10% of grinding. So again, so 25% of grinding, you got 77. And the highest reported for the normal water control was 195. So that compares well. But what if they only did 10% grinding? Then your actual grinding time exposure, like I said, goes up to 156. And it looks better than 195, but not so much. So anyways, I make that point. All right, now let's go back because I have here, before we get to the good stuff. So I did do an assessment. All right, so this was my first assessment, and this was during active sampling. So I was actually sampling a person. So we got the 4 sensors in a box. We got another sensor over here. And what I did is I was able to help them with sheet wetting. So the first interesting thing is I started the personal sample when we began sheet wetting. And so I'm able to go back and look at times when he wasn't using sheet wetting compared to when he was. So this is when he was sheet wetting. And I'll zoom in here to show you. I basically held the center feed tool and added more water there. And number 1 is when he was grinding in the same location. See how that's the same location? He was grinding, and there was no fan on actually at this point. This was early in the morning, and no sheet wetting. And then I kind of combined 2 days. This was with the fan on, but again grinding. And this was a different day, or these were 2 different. This was a different day, both of these. And again, he was grinding here. And if you look at the results, the sheet wetting does seem to help. When you look at the Hunter sensor, much lower. So this is very promising. When you look at the Busey sensor, much lower. So also very promising. Now I'm not going to go into detail here, but when I did the same analysis for blade cutting, and I didn't see a difference. So that's the first thing I learned is I decided I'm going to concentrate on implementing this for grinding because I didn't see that working too well for the blades. Okay, so then I also went and did my own testing. This is the first time I did my own testing. So I went out there, I set up a slab, I set out some sensors, and I did some grinding. And this time I used the hose again. I'm doing my own grinding here. And so here we have center feed, and you see how one sensor is getting nailed here. The other sensors are not, so we can kind of concentrate on that. And this was the center feed plus the hose plus the sheet wetting, very low. Then it went back to center feed and it went up, and then it was sheet wetting and went down. So again, more promising data. And this is in 2000s, I think. So if you look at this scale, we're getting up to 2000. We're getting below 250. So that was very promising. Now I'm going to talk about this when in the final analysis is see how this peak is so much higher than this other one with center feed. And so I felt like when you first have this raw edge, this sharp edge, that was the first run I did, is that it's going to create the most dust than if you go back and grind on it more. So when I do the final test here, I'll show you that I started out with sheet wetting on this edge, but then I turned the slab around and I did the center feed with the edge as well. And then if you're interested, so I did a little dry grinding, and you can see here how much different the dry grinding is than even just the center feed. So the center feed works very well. Now I can also look back at old data and kind of make some estimates here. Here we had a grinder, no sheet wetting. There's a sensor, very high results. Here we have an employee that was doing their sheet wetting without being prompted or anything. There's the sensor there. and that seems really low. So, but again, there's so many different factors that could contribute to this, but you can see the evidence is starting to pile up. All right, now this is where it gets really fun. So this is the final assessment of the sheet wetting, and I've taken everything I've learned up to this point to kind of seal the deal here and do a test on my own. And one of the fun things is, so this was actually from the NIOSH document. The stone shop that they went to had this, so we made one of these and this is going to help them when they have to implement the sheet wetting. That makes it easy for them. So I get to call it the Tommy Bahama because Tommy was the maintenance guy who made it, and I get to have a little fun there. But so here, when we say sheet wetting in this example, this is what we're implementing here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the results, go through the good news, and then at the end here, I'm going to show you some videos describing what was going on. And so here's the center feed, and you can barely see it, but water spraying out the center. Now here's the air exhaust I was talking about, and this is going to matter, but this is blowing out air, right, at high speed, really pushing out air, and I think that has an effect as well. So now I deployed 7 sensors, which is awesome. So these are the sensor locations: Busey, Slingshot. So you see Busey here, Slingshots here. I got sockets here, kind of hang above here somewhere. I wonder if no, that's Slingshot. I think sockets is right here. And then I've got the beta Dylos I have here at the corner of the table. And the proto Dylos I have here at this corner. And then I stuck Joe behind the proto. This is Joe here. This is the proto. And then we've got Hunter here by the fans, okay, kind of behind what's going on. Yeah, here is Saki's here. So we have kind of Sakis and Hunter bracketing in beta and proto, and Joe kind of bracketing the slab. So this is why one of my recommendations, and then this is why I brought this up, is let's move all this stuff. And if we got to grind, let's put the cart with the slab against the wall here as close as we can get it to take advantage of these fans. These fans are going to draw the dust and water out very quickly. We all know, IHs know that fans are limited, but in this case these work very well. And like I said, in this location, when they do work, the sensors are dead because the dust isn't getting to them. So I wanted to make that point because that's part of the recommendation. And I even go so far. Now I don't know, one thing I would have to test is it better for them to grind on this side, right, kind of facing the fans, as opposed to this side? I would think probably this side would be better. So I had some space constraints here, but that would probably be a test I would want to do to kind of definitively say, you know, this would pull dust away from the person, whereas the dust kind of comes back towards them, so to speak. Okay, so there's the setup. And so now here, what I did is I did sheet wetting on the raw edge plus center feed. Okay, so this is the whole point. This is the enhanced control. We use the center feed water, and then we add more water with the sheet wetting. All right, and then I did another run after a little break of the edge that had already been grinded on with the sheet wetting. So that's the first run. This is the second run. You see the amplitude here as compared to when I did the center feed only. This was the raw edge, and then this is the grinded edge. So this is an example of, you see the difference between the raw edge and something that's already been tapped on. You know, this is an example of, you know, that research, that article, when they compared the sheet wetting from a day in a shop to years earlier, a different shop, different day. We just know that they were center feed grinding. These are the kind of differences that you don't know that would obviously matter a lot. You know, what if that day of that they're let's say the day that they were assessing, they were doing a lot of raw edging, and the other day they were doing how would it work? Let's say they weren't doing raw or let's say they were doing raw edging on that day and they were really high. In the sheet wetting assessment, they weren't doing a lot of raw edging. Well, that's kind of artificial comparison there. But anyways, so here we see these are from the diloses, okay, the beta and the proto. And you see here that the proto is the one between the two that's really jumping up. And this is where I'm talking about the exhaust feed. And I got to show you in video, I held the grinder a different way between run 1 and run 2. So we can't even say whether or not that the edging is totally everything to do with these results, although they're very consistent. It could have been the orientation change, so I can't even say that. But you're going to see that it seems like the dust is getting shot in these, especially in these first runs towards Proto and Joe. So here's Busey. So again, here's the sheet wetting run. Here's just the center feed, and we see an immediate visual difference. So this is what I'm talking about, how you can help people. You can win the argument. You can be persuasive when you pile this evidence up, and now you know more for sure, because you don't want to recommend all these changes and then actually not have anything happen or any reductions seen. So you want to be sure yourself. So this is the kind of data that kind of brings that home. So here again, we see now, you see the amplitudes are different. Which way am I going here? Okay. So this was, 350, whereas this one was up to 14,000. So you also have to look at the amplitude. Here's Saki. Saki's kind of had the same amount of amplitude. This was 350, 300. Here it's 300, 500. So this one was more the second run, which means something, but we'd have to investigate that. But you see here a clear difference in the Sakis. And here we have Joe. Now you see Joe here, just like the Proto, very high levels. Even pretty high for the sheet wetting, right? The sheet wetting's not perfect, but again, relatively speaking, I can make a good prediction that even my personal sample is going to be less, because you can kind of use this as a surrogate, all these sensor readings, that it's making less dust, so obviously the personal is going to be less as well. But again, this really helps protect anybody else in the area. As you can see here, this is the area getting polluted without sheet wetting, and this is with. And you can kind of see, you can do a lot of self-checks here, like the two sensors that were near each other, Proto and Joe. You can see, look at the profile, very similar. All right, and then we have Hunter. So this is the one by the fans, and we see here all of these have a clear difference between the two. But you see here Joe is so much higher. So that's where I get the idea that that exhaust is pushing dust parallel to the fans at first, right? And you see here much more higher dust rating here than maybe intuitively you would think would be over here by the fans, although these are also in front of a fan. And then we've got Slingshot. Now Slingshot, for some reason you see here the second run was the highest, but I make the observation, and I think, this is now far away from the work. The fans are pulling it this way. This is like the outer edge. Any dust getting thrown this way, a little bit of factors could change how much gets there, but regardless, it's very low to begin with, so there's really not much difference here. Just something to note. All right, so now I'm going to show you some videos from that actual testing, but I think you can see here that this makes a strong argument that less dust is made with the sheet wetting, and it will be a positive. And again, I say let's put the work area there when we're grinding. And the other thing I'm going to recommend is wherever is best, whatever side is best, move the slab. When you got to grind the other slab, actually physically turn the table around, like I did to get the new edge for runs 3 and 4, and keep grinding in that location. You know, you can move this to accommodate that. It's going to take a little more work, a little bit more time, but I think it's worth it. Okay, I almost forgot to mention, I make one more note here. So there is Joe. So also to kind of show the difference. So I have an alarm set. I forget what it's for exactly, but when I did this first run, I got 2 alarms for Joe. One was like 1,000, the other was 3,000. When I got to just the center feed, much more alarms for Joe, and then I even got an alarm for Hunter. So that just shows you that you know, an alarm function would also help, and you would expect a more dustier operation to trigger alarms or trigger more alarms, and that's exactly what happened. I got 2 alarms total from here. I got, I think, 6 or 7 alarms from here. Alright, so I got all the fans on that can be on. So I'm going to test 2 things. I'm going to test this sheet wetting, and I'm going to be grinding on this slab here. So all the fans are on. So this is Busey. This is Slingshot. Okay, up there is Hunter. There is Saki's kind of right above. And then Joe's over there. Proto there, Beta there. So I'm also going to test the position. I think that we can take advantage of the fans here and get as close to this wall as possible so that all the dust gets sucked out. I usually find that when they're working over here, there's not a lot of dust. So last time I tested the grinder, I did this edge first with just the center water, and it was a very high amount compared to the rest. Even when I went to sheet wetting back to regular, I almost think that this is the worst dust part, is getting this edge. So I'm going to start with sheet wetting on this edge. And so you can see here, just want to show you, this is a center spray grinder. Alright, so it's 3:08. I'm about to get started. Here's my sheet wetting pipe. Alright, so I'm going to start on this edge with the sheet wetting. Alright, my exhaust is coming out right here. So that's where the exhaust is going to go. I might also hold it like this. I've seen them do it like this as well. So I think I'll start out like this, where I've seen them do it. Okay, so this time I'm going to do sheet wetting, but I'm going to hold the grinder like this. Alrighty, so again, Joe's up here. The rest were pretty much, we'll see. Not that affected. Alright, so it's 3:45. I flipped this around, so I'm going to do the sharp edge again. This side of the sharp edge, this is the side I worked on. And I'm going to do this not with the sheet wetting, of course, just the center feed.